Committee. Great, and we are live. I want the Groundhog Day jokes to be live. This is part of it. Yes, this is our second half of the House Government Operations Military Affairs Committee this morning on February 2nd. Carol Dawes of the Vermont Municipal Clerks and Treasurers Association is here, and I think you've been with us during our discussion of the proposed committee bill language around a number of different elections items, and would love to hear your testimony and feedback on that.
For the record.
Oh, we're not hearing you in the room, Carol. Hold on one second. It must be on her. I think it's on your end.
I'm unmuted. Are you hearing anything?
There we go. We're hearing you now. I'm just going to turn you up. Perfect.
Berry City Clerk and Treasurer, chair of the Legislative Committee for the Clerk and Treasurers Association. So what's your pleasure? Do you want to go back to the elections bill, the committee bill, or should we continue on H-149?
So I would say that I wanted to get H-149 on the table, but it seems to have an enormous amount of overlap, at least in its goals. And so I'm going to focus on the committee bill language, I think, at this point, because that's what I'm more familiar with. But the spirit of 149 seemed to be aligned with what we were discussing in those sections.
I feel there are a couple differences between the committee bill and 149. And I will point them out as we get to there. The committee bill, the only two sections that are the only two areas that really touch upon clerks is the candidate demographic information and the write-in information. And with regards to the candidate demographic information, as Mr. Senning said, the clerks already report information to the Secretary of State's office. So, filling in a couple more columns on a spreadsheet is not an additional burden to us. My only concern, and they addressed it in the most recent revision, is I didn't want there to be a responsibility on the clerk's behalf to collect or pester candidates for the information. If the candidate chooses not to provide that information, we'll report what we've got, and that's it. And the bill is now changed to reflect that. With regards to the write-in candidate registration, as has been mentioned, this is something that we, the association, have been pushing for a number of years. I was pleased that Reverend Brennan shared the numbers from his Colchester clerk, so that my numbers are not the only ones that you're going to have. As an example, for the 2022 primary here in Berry City, we had 212 different names on the August primary elections, all of which we had to individually tally, enter into the system. They represented 522 votes for those 212 different people. The highest vote getter was Governor Scott, who was written in 69 times on the Democratic ballot as a candidate for governor. And the vast majority of the write-ins that we see for primary are those kinds of votes where the voter doesn't understand the primary process, and they feel limited in their ability to vote for the candidates they're interested in voting for. So they write them in on the opposite party. And we have to tally all of those.
Could I just ask you to clarify? And then I also think Representative Hango has a clarifying question. So when you say that it seems like the voter doesn't understand the primary process, could you maybe elaborate on what your understanding of what the purpose of the primary process is? I know I'm asking you a really loaded question. So if you want to, I want to just lay that out there and you can tell me what you'd like to say.
Okay, so I would say, and this is my personal opinion, that the purpose of the primary is for local communities to do the work of the parties. But besides that, it's to obviously help decide who the candidates are going to be for the statewide and federal offices. Where it gets challenging for the voter is they're used to looking at the general election ballot where they're not beholden to a particular party, where they can vote their choice for their candidates regardless of party, and they like the option of being able to move around to different parties. And they don't have that option on the primary because they don't understand the primaries are complicated in that people don't understand that they're helping one party make selections for candidates. They get all these ballots. They're told they can only vote one of them. And they say, but I want, one from column A and one from column B. How do I do that? And so quite frequently, people will take either whatever one of the three ballots, and they will write in all their choices, regardless of party. And they don't understand that what they're doing is they're writing those people in to be the party candidate for that particular office. It's something that clerks across the state spend a lot of time trying to do voter education on, but it continues to be a challenge for us. And it is reflected very heavily in the write-ins that we have to tally.
Representative Hango had a question, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a question more than just to add a different perspective than the one that you're bringing. You're obviously seeing it from a political party standpoint that the parties are trying to get their candidates lined up. But from an average voter who I've spoken with many, from their perspective, they feel like, okay, I have to choose one ballot and it's for one particular political party, right, in the primary. So if my preferred candidate doesn't happen to be on that ballot, either I leave it blank or I vote for somebody that I really don't want to vote for. So that's why they're writing it in on that particular ballot, because they want their candidate that they like to be in the general election, regardless of what party they belong to. And I actually feel very strongly about that, that people have that choice. And by allowing write-ins, they're allowed that choice.
If I may, I don't think that what Representative Hango is saying is inconsistent with what our clerk here is saying, which is that there appears to be out in the public that desire to say, I want to support this person. But if the purpose of the primary is to nominate the candidate for a specific party, and you are putting the individual you want to win the election on the ballot for a party's primary that they have no affiliation with, that is some confusion. So I think we're talking about the same thing, but approaching it from two different perspectives. And this exact thing is something I wanted to get out on the table with this bill. So I'm so glad to be having this conversation.
So can I just add one more thing? I don't think it's a misunderstanding on people's part. I think it's a deliberate choice that people are making. And that is why I don't want to see the multi-party affiliation go away. So laid that on the table.
Okay. Interesting. Representative Hooper and then Representative Nugent, and I want to make sure we're leaving time for Carol to talk about things, because we're going to have time to debate these things ad nauseum, I think.
I agree with a lot of the stuff Representative Hango. I've talked to a lot of people at the polls who thought, I have a Democratic ballot, but I like Phil Scott, so I'm going to write Phil Scott in, and his name will then be associated with that vote when they count. which is completely, totally wrong, but I think that's a perception in a lot of people that you can vote outside the name of the ballots and it'll actually get credited to the candidate team.
That is a confusion that I think is common. That's a good flag. Representative Nugent.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, piggyback on what Representative Hango was saying, that I think people are a lot smarter than we may give them credit for. And to me, it's so helpful in this era where we have so few ways to really understand like individual choices, and, media is so national, and there's, we're losing like that connection. Even with polling, is hard to get that information. That's one of the few things that we can see, like how voters are actually feeling and what they really want. And it's, I think, good data for everybody to see where people are at with that.
Yeah, so I think what I want to park and get back to Carol's testimony is the primary write-in a true expression of what the primary is there for, which is to select the nominees, or are some of the ideas that are being thrown on the table today suggesting that that you would prefer that we have fully open primaries where regardless of party? And so I think there's a tension between these ideas. And so I want to park them and come back to them so that we can get to talking about the words on the page. But I'll give Representative Mrowicki one last comment, and then we're going to return to Ms. Dawes' testimony.
Just to muddy the waters even more, California and Washington consider their primaries open, but it's called top two tier.
Representative Byron just put a sticky note next to me that said jungle primary ? So I just want to let everybody know at home that we do not have any bill proposed, and we're not talking about jungle primaries today, but it gets at the thing that we're talking about. And I believe the Clerks and Treasurers Association might have a lot to say if we went to a top two.
Those are totally open primaries, though.
Yeah.
We're talking about the whole spectrum of options.
Yep. So we are talking about the philosophical underpinnings that would lead one to support that policy versus some of the things we have today or have on the page. So thank you very much, Carol, for indulging us.
Oh, I'm sorry. I seem to have poked the hornet's nest, but.
Oh no, that is not your fault. That's mine.
I will say that I have a lot of conversations with voters about what it is that they're doing in the primary and what they want to do. And I completely agree with the comments about, voters wanting to be able to express their choices, but then having them understand that with the primary system and the ballots the way they are now, any name that they write onto a particular ballot is going to be considered a vote for that person in that political party. And that's where the misunderstandings tend to happen. But we would love to see some kind of a way to have the write-ins contained by the consent of candidate forms or some way, so that as I said, you heard what Colchester's numbers are, you heard what Berry City's numbers are, and in addition to the ones where, the 69 people who did write in Phil Scott on the Democratic ballot, there are huge numbers of them that are people just writing in their own names or writing in their best friend's name or whatever, because they want to see that name reflected on a final report and be able to say, look, they gotta vote. It seems like it would be great to have a way to avoid that sort of the need to tally those kinds of votes that feel a little frivolous. The language in section 13, starting in 14, which is specific to local elections. And this is one of the big differences between H-149 and the committee bill, is that for local elections, the submission of some kind of a consent form wouldn't be needed until close of polls on election day. The reason behind that for local elections is as we've brought this forward over the last several years, we heard, and it was mentioned earlier today, we heard a lot of talk about the sort of grassroots process that can happen around town meeting elections, as an example, where, if there's a vacancy on the school board and a group of people have talked, been talking with Bob Smith, who says, yeah, I'll throw my hat in the ring. And so there's people who are working to get Bob Smith written in on the ballot on town meeting day. And that's the reason why we proposed the language to have the consent form right up until close of polls, because those grassroots efforts can happen on the day or the day before town meeting. And so giving an opportunity to have that process play out, but then have the clerks have the official names, as it were, by close of polls, so we know what the names are that we should be tallying, that we should be on the lookout for. So that's the main reason why the difference in dates between the state and federal elections and the local elections. Are there other questions on write-in stuff?
So my overarching question before we go to another one in the room is it your position and the position of the association that you support the language as it is in the committee bill draft that we've been considering?
Yeah.
Thank you. Representative Waters Evans has a question.
I have a couple questions. I don't know if this is the time or place or person to ask, but I'm wondering if there is like a historical context for write-ins and how that concept was introduced in the first place. Or, has it been going on forever or?
I don't know the history of write-ins. We have a ballot, a framed ballot on the wall here in the office from the late 1800s, and it has a space on it for write-ins.
Okay.
So I'm assuming that they have been around for a long time.
All right. And my other question, and I am not being flippant in any way. So you guys work so hard. And I get it. And I've talked to my town clerk about it too, about how the write-ins are a problem. But is there a problem other than the fact that it just takes time and is annoying? Like, do you know what I mean? I don't want to be rude, but my question is, I totally understand that it takes as long as it does to count the regular votes, and nobody wants to be writing down, Buzz Lightyear on a write-in, like on the candidate form or whatever. But I'm just wondering if there's any other issue of greater significance that it presents within the parameters of time and irritation.
First of all, thankfully, we don't have to write Buzz Lightyear down. Any
Okay.
Or people who are dead, people who aren't qualified candidates. Say I had a write-in for somebody who lived 3 towns over for city council. I wouldn't have to write them down because they can't serve as a city councilor in Berry City. So we don't have to tally those. And certainly there is a component of it as far as the amount of time necessary. It's a very long day. But the bigger concern is, what is the value to cataloging all these different names and votes, particularly when it's clear that many of them, most of them are a one-off. Most of them are just somebody wanting to, I mean, I've had people come up to me as they're leaving the polls going, hey, I wrote you down for state treasurer, just because they wanted to put it in there. And, you know, to me, there's little value in cataloging those. While if we established a way to clarify who the legitimate write-in candidates were, and be able to codify those, count those votes, we still would count the write-ins. And this is one of the differences between H-149 and the committee bill, is that the committee bill says they still would be counted as write-ins. They would be, I think what was the term that's used was generic write-in votes. They at least would be counted as write-ins. They just wouldn't be listed individually. Whereas in H-149, it just says they'd be counted as blank. It does make sense that they should be acknowledged as write-in votes, but there doesn't need to be the laundry list of the different individual names.
Representative Hango.
Were you done?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted a definition of that term, generic write-ins, because the attorney wasn't sure of the actual definition, and town clerks kind of use that term. So it's just, they're not listed by name, they're just counted. And we had 10 write-ins today. That's a generic write-in.
Yeah, it would, you know, example at town meeting, if I had 3 people turn in consent forms saying I am running as a write-in campaign, a write-in candidate for school board and for city council, and we then, during tallying of the ballots, we had, you know, 50 write-ins and 30 of them were for the named candidates, we would put the ballots, put the counts for those named candidates under write-ins, and then we would have sort of an all other write-in kind of, whether we use the term generic or other or unnamed, or some term that identifies that they are also write-ins, but they haven't been sort of authorized by the consent of candidate forms.
So what another way to say that is that if we passed this language, that there would be potential for candidates who had done the consent, they would be counted and their vote totals of their write-ins with their name would be in the report. But that all other write-ins would just be kind of lumped in as write-ins, generic write-ins, as just the total number of write-ins regardless of name. So you, for instance, gave the example of a few hundred votes of that represented a couple hundred candidate names, so that the sort of average was 1 or 2 votes per candidate named, and that all of those would just be lumped in as one line instead of listing out the 200 names.
Correct.
All right.
Which seemed to make more sense. The H-149 says that if they haven't gone through the sort of consent process to be a named write-in candidate, those write-in votes would just be considered blank. It does make sense to acknowledge that people did take the time to write in rather than just leave it blank, and that would be part of our tallying at the end of the day.
Representative Nugent has a question.
I'm wondering, I guess, if this is common, because I, just being like a data nerd maybe, and how we had a lot of, in some of the state level elections, there were quite a few people in the primary Democratic. And so I was curious to see like the vote tallies. And when I looked at that, there were a lot of write-ins for like the people who didn't win the primary, and wouldn't have, I don't think, put themselves on the ballot. But I think that's kind of interesting and helpful to see where people are at. And I thought I thought I saw like many write-ins for the same candidates for some of those like statewide elections, like Attorney General, Secretary of State, Lieutenant Governor, those kind of things.
Any other questions for Clerk Dawes? All right. Carol, feel free to stick around. I think we're gonna invite Will back up for the end of the Elections Division comments and walkthrough on the sections that he wasn't able to cover. Everybody's been very patient with me trying to roll out all of this. So if you want to hang in the room, please feel welcome to listen in, and you may be able to chime in with some supportive comments during Will's batting cleanup here.
Will and I did speak late yesterday afternoon, and the draft of the bill as it currently exists certainly reflects the comments that he and I, the conversation he and I had yesterday. So as I said, the association supports the draft as currently exists. I am going to sit in the background and listen, but I have to start proofing my town meeting ballots. So
I appreciate you being here during this busy time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Welcome back, Will. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
being patient with us.
And excuse me. And I think maybe we'll pick up there on the write-in section while it's fresh in folks' heads, and I can respond to a few items. As Carol mentioned, we can go right to that. The H-149 and is based on, at my first glance at it, similarly legislation that was introduced a couple of years ago, 2 or 4 years ago, and also included that language where write-in votes, for people who had not filed the form would be counted as blank. I can't remember if that language came from our office or not, but I have rethought that since then and feel like it is a better approach to report them as write-ins. We use the word generic in here. That can be changed if people don't like that. And it was that was my last minute move with Tim. The point is what you were discussing, though, is that you would still have a row on the results spreadsheet that is write-ins that hadn't registered. And I think it's valuable information for people to know, the general quantity of votes that are being written in versus left blank. I think there is a distinction there, right, in what the voter's communicating. To put a fine point on that, I hope everyone appreciates that we keep really close track in elections and results of elections. So, for instance, what I'm talking about is we know how many ballots were cast in each town or in each district. And what we look for on the official returns of votes that the clerks file is that the bottom lines reflect that number. That means that you have a full accounting of the votes cast in each of those races of each ballot. I don't know that that's the practice everywhere. And it's interesting. It's a distinction in how the votes are counted here at the legislature for some of the statewide offices, to be frank. If you do it the way we do it, which is make sure you account for every single ballot, you have the categories you have are candidate names, write-ins, blanks, overvotes, and that leads to a total.
Did you define overvote for the uninitiated?
Overvotes are somebody who marks more ovals than candidates to be elected in a certain race. Most of our races are vote for one, the statewide offices. So say you vote for 2 gubernatorial candidates. The people counting your vote can't make a judgment about which of those was the intended vote. They can't pick out of the 2 you marked. So what do they do with that? They say it's an overvote. And in a vote for one race, you record 1 overvote there, because you would expect 1 vote to be cast for for that race on that ballot. And for instance, a vote for two race in one of your districts, if somebody then goes ahead and votes for three candidates, same, you can't choose which two out of the three they meant. That's reported on the official return of votes as two in the overvote column, actually. Because you would expect to have two candidate votes above. And that's how, if you look at their official returns of vote and what we tear our hair out in the week after the elections when we're talking about results processing, to show that the bottom lines in each of those races add up to the same thing. Most of the time, it's actually not, it's that accounting for overvotes that throws those off. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about here, of it's just which of those categories we want to put certain votes in. I think why the term blank came through, because in the same bill, some provisions that did pass in that bill in the past is what Carol's referring to, where we finally said that the fictitious names and the names of dead persons should be counted as blanks. That's current law and is in there. So if they come across the Abe Lincoln or Mickey Mouse or the other guy, Buzz, those go in as blanks, but it leads to that same accounting, that ballot, that vote cast is accounted for. So that's what we're talking about here, is if somebody didn't file, how are we going to report that vote and have the bottom line totals still continue to line up for each of the races? And I think instead of calling them blanks, it makes sense to have a line for write-ins that haven't filed. And so just as Carol described, you're going to have your named candidates on the ballot. You're going to have any registered write-in candidate names and their totals. Write-ins, be it if we call them other write-ins, generic write-ins, unfiled write-ins, and then blanks and overvotes. That way, if people looking at the results have a general idea of how many write-ins were cast in a given race that weren't just blank votes, people skipping over it. More importantly, what I want to make sure the committee understands and call your attention to, that there are two places. We talked about the 4 elections that are being addressed here: presidential primary, statewide primary, general election, local elections. In 2 of those, the primary election and local elections, there is a minimum threshold requirement for write-ins. Primary, you have to get written in, I believe you have to have 1/2 of the numbers that are on the petition. And in locals, it's 30 or 1% of the checklist, whichever is less. The most important thing I think that the committee should consider, and I'd be really curious Carol's opinion on this too as I talk it through, is whether someone who failed to register as a write-in candidate with these new deadlines 2 Fridays before the election should still be able to be declared the winner if they were to receive enough votes across those minimum thresholds. The way the language is currently written in both cases, no. And that is certainly the easier way to administer it for the clerks. Because then again, they get their list of names, and those are the only names that they're even paying attention to how many votes are cast for that person. If you if you wanted to go with a middle ground, where you said in general, we're just going to report the names of candidates who have filed beforehand. The vast majority, and right in the general election context and the presidential primary context, you're really just talking about saving the clerks a massive headache of reporting names. The ballots are full of names. The minimum thresholds don't matter, because even if they cross those thresholds, they're getting so many fewer votes than any of the named candidates. Those thresholds exist in the primary and in local elections because it's much more likely that there's going to be an open, nobody filed for a certain office. We talked about the Republican and progressive primaries where there's many, many offices that are empty and don't have candidates filed. That's where those thresholds become important. But when I think this through in my head, that middle ground reduces a lot of the positive impact of this for the clerks, because it means that their counters still have to be paying attention and counting really carefully, adding up the vote totals of the various names that they see in those instances to see whether or not they would cross the threshold. I could see a version of this bill that says You don't have to report any names in any of these instances like we have it. Unless a person were to cross the threshold, and I've thought through in a race for an office that had no named candidates, that could kind of target the attention of the clerk. So in this empty race, I want to make sure you're counting and seeing if anybody hits the threshold. A cleaner way, and I think it still makes sense to me, and I still support it as it's written, is just to say, if you even want to qualify over those thresholds, you got to think ahead and file the paperwork 2 Fridays before the election. And the clerks really don't even have to keep track of adding up the totals that might be written in for one name, might be written in 2 or 3 times. Unless they're registered, they're just putting that in the writing column, I just thought that was important to point out. I didn't want to gloss over it as we're having the discussion.
In the close of the polls deadline for local elections gets at that issue to an extent.
To an extent, yeah. It's still, if somebody missed by the close of the polls, there's an empty office on your local ballot, which is pretty common, and somebody didn't reach the threshold, but hadn't filed by the close of the polls, as it's written right now, they wouldn't take that office.
Representative Chase.
So what if there was an empty position with nobody on the ballot and only, 5 people bothered to write in somebody and they all wrote in the same person? Would that position just not be filled? Or?
Yes. Pretty common too, to come out of local elections with certain positions.
Yeah, I think this is a question that, given that we're bumping up against time, this is definitely one that we need to think through. I wonder if Carol has any initial reaction, if she hates to do this to her, but we could take that another time since you had asked, Will.
Sorry, are you asking me for some feed for input?
Yeah, Carol. So Will had brought up the idea of.
I heard what he was talking about.
Yeah, a threshold for write-in candidates, even if they didn't file, and if that would sort of negate the virtue of the system that is envisioned in this draft language.
I can sort of see a middle ground of a middle ground. If it's depending on whether it's the kind of, as an example, I have a 2-person legislative district in Berry City. So I would know whether I had anybody who had the requisite 25 signatures. If it sticks with half of the petition amount, I would know for a local election if I might have that number. But for one of the offices that's up for election where you aggregate numbers across legislative districts or counties or statewide, obviously it becomes a bigger issue. So I think it's worth having some additional think time around it.
It's a very good point, Carol. Thank you. And I don't want to brainstorm in front of the committee, but that might be addressed by, right, if it were limited to scenarios where there were no candidate on the ballot. And then we could have all the clerks that are counting votes for that given office that's empty be aware of the need to. At that point, though, you're right. You're back to basically reporting the totals for everybody on that race.
But only in that race.
Only in that race.
Ballot. Yeah, I think that's worth. So I just want to, for Tim, our legislative counsel who's in the room, and for everybody, I think the next iteration of us talking about this, I'd like us all to think through if there's no candidate on the ballot, a threshold where it would make sense, because that seems to me to be a middle ground unless there's something I'm missing.
But I'd say, keep in mind, right, the filing deadline for the primaries where this is going to be an issue is in late May. And you have 2.5 months to file this write-in candidacy for the parties themselves to identify an empty office, figure out somebody who they want to be their write-in candidate for that office and file. The much cleaner approach is what's here, and the much more easy for the clerks to follow and not to have to be thinking about these various exceptions to the rule. Just keep in mind the amount of time that people have to figure it out and get this write-in paperwork filed.
I'm very supportive of the idea that we probably want to be electing people who know that they're a candidate for office, have thought it through at least a week and a half before the election. That's me. We should really talk about that. So we have had quite a morning. Is there anything else, Will, that you'd like to tell us about the first pass on this draft language in the next few minutes?
Now I am brainstorming in front of you, but another option could be, just to put in folks' heads, picking elections here. This is a serious problem in the presidential primary that raises none of these other issues. And we could just say don't have to report those names of anybody who doesn't register for the presidential primary. There's always a full slate of candidates. There's no minimum threshold. Same thing for the general election. We could think about whether there's a special rule or an exception in the primary would be one other way to approach it.
So just for folks who may not have been involved in a lot of the primary elections, we get into a situation with a primary election and there's no name on the ballot for a party. What's the current procedure that happens when there is no candidate for one of the major parties?
People write in whoever they choose to write in, if anyone. And there's a minimum threshold to win. And then above that, it's, who gets more.
So let's just say hypothetically, House race, the minimum threshold's 25 signatures, 25 votes because it's a 50 signature threshold. And 20 people write in John Doe. So he doesn't quite make the threshold. What's the mechanism if the party wanted to make John Doe the nominee for that party on the general election? They can just hold a caucus and do that, right?
Pretty quickly right after the primary, but yes, that's one of the reasons by which a party committee can nominate is failure to nominate by the primary.
So the primary election itself isn't the only opportunity. Representative Morgan.
Yeah, I believe on that. I think the process, if I understand it correctly, they have to have a duly warned, properly warned meeting to conduct that business, correct?
Correct. And it's depending on the office is which committee conducts that.
Thank you.
State committee, state offices, county offices. Yep.
Well, thank you very much, Carol, Will, Tim. This has been a highly educational morning, and we got a lot out onto the table. It's kind of the week for that. I know that we have, we're switching gears this afternoon and tomorrow on other topics, but we'll be coming back, I think, Tuesday afternoon to take in a look and hearing from some other voices on a couple of these issues specifically. It's my impression at this point. We'll be getting an agenda out for next week tomorrow. It's always one of the most challenging things to figure out here. But yeah, I will be seeing everybody back here this afternoon. I think we're on at 1 o'clock. We will be talking about the sports wagering and with some experts on problem gambling. So